The letter that brought Lucy Sutton to Montana Territory had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn soft as cloth, and she read it once more by the light of the stagecoach window as the wheels ground over the last frozen ruts before Willow Creek came into view. Wanted, a capable woman for housekeeping and care of 2 children. Must be sober, industrious, and willing to keep good order in a home that has gone too long without it. Wages fair. Inquire at the Willow Creek post office for Orville Hartwell. She had answered that advertisement in October with nothing left to lose, and now, in the first bitter week of November of the year 1886, she was riding toward a stranger's ranch with $4 in her purse and everything she owned in a single trunk lashed to the coach behind her. Her father had been dead 8 months. The shop he had run in Springfield, Ohio, had gone to his creditors within weeks of the funeral, and Lucy had discovered, in the terrible arithmetic of grief, that a schoolteacher's daughter with a good hand for figures and no family left to shelter her had very few respectable paths open to her. She could not abide the thought of taking in sewing for the rest of her days in a boarding-house room too small to turn around in. When she had seen the advertisement reprinted in a Cincinnati paper, placed by some enterprising editor who sold frontier advertisements to Eastern readers hungry for adventure or desperate for wages, she had written before she could talk herself out of it. The stagecoach lurched and Lucy caught the strap above the window, steadying herself as the driver called out that Willow Creek was a quarter mile on. Outside, the land had gone the color of old bone, grass bent flat under a wind that smelled of snow not yet fallen. She had never seen country so wide open, so entirely without the comfort of trees closed together or fences marking where one man's land ended and another's began. It frightened her a little, the size of it, and it also loosened something in her chest that had been clenched tight since her father's last breath. She arrived in town near dusk, and the boarding house where she took a room for the night was run by a stout, kind-eyed widow named Pearl Dutton, who fed her stew and biscuits and studied her with the frank appraisal of a woman who had seen a great many strangers pass through her door. "You are the one answering Orville Hartwell's notice," Pearl said, not a question. "I am, if the position is still open." "Open as a barn door in a windstorm," Pearl said, setting down a second helping of stew though Lucy had not asked for it. "3 women have gone up to that ranch since his wife passed, and not one has stayed past the first snow. He is not a cruel man, understand me, but he is exact. Everything by its hour and its place. His wife Margaret kept house like that naturally, the way some women hum while they work, and when the diphtheria took her 2 winters back, he tried to hold on to the same order with his own 2 hands, and it about broke him trying. And the children. Amelia is 7, sharp as a tack and lonesome as an owl. Thomas is 5 and has not said 10 words together since his mother died, though the doctor says there is nothing wrong with his tongue that grief did not put there." Pearl shook her head. "That ranch needs a woman's hand, Miss Sutton, but it needs a particular kind of woman, one with backbone enough not to be run off, and heart enough not to go hard and brittle trying to please him." Lucy thought of her father's shop, of keeping the ledgers straight while he told stories to the customers, of the years of order and industry that had, in the end, not been enough to save them from ruin. "I believe I can manage exact," she said. "I have had a great deal of practice." Pearl studied her a moment longer, then nodded, as if some private accounting had come out in Lucy's favor. "Ranch is 6 miles north. I will have my boy drive you up in the morning. You will want your coat buttoned to the throat. Wind out there does not care for manners." The Hartwell Ranch, when the wagon crested the last rise the following morning, sat in a shallow bowl of land with a good creek running along its western edge and a scatter of cottonwoods gone bare and silver in the early light. The house was larger than Lucy had expected, 2 stories of timber with a wide porch, but even from a distance she could see the signs of a household straining against its own untended edges. A shutter hung crooked at an upstairs window. The porch steps wanted mending. Smoke rose thin and gray from the chimney as though someone had banked the fire too carefully, afraid to waste the wood. Orville Hartwell was in the yard when the wagon rolled in, splitting kindling with the grim efficiency of a man for whom the task was less about the fire and more about the doing of it, the having of something to master with his hands. He set the axe down when he saw them and came forward, and Lucy's first thought, unbidden and immediately suppressed, was that grief had carved him into something lean and watchful, the way a hard winter carves a hillside. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, stepping down before he could offer a hand. "I am Lucy Sutton. I wrote to you concerning the position." He looked at her the way she imagined he might look at a horse he was considering buying, not unkindly but thoroughly. "You are younger than I pictured from your letter." "I am 24, sir, if that is a concern. I kept my father's household and his shop accounts both, from the time I was 16 until his death this past spring. I am not afraid of work." "It is not fear of work I need answered for. It is steadiness." He glanced toward the house, where a curtain in an upstairs window twitched and fell still, a small face disappearing behind it. "There have been women here before you who found the work agreeable enough until the first hard week, and then found reasons to be elsewhere. I have 2 children who have already lost one mother. I will not have them grow fond of a woman only to watch her go." The bluntness of it should have offended her, perhaps, but instead Lucy heard beneath the words something rower, a fear he would not have named even to himself. "I have nowhere else to be, Mr. Hartwell," she said. "I did not come 600 miles on the strength of a newspaper notice to turn tail at the first hard week. If you will have me, I intend to stay through the winter at the very least, and longer if the work suits us both." Something in his face eased, not quite a softening, more the loosening of a man who had braced for an argument and found none. "Come inside, then, and I will show you what needs doing. There is a great deal of it." There was, indeed, a great deal of it. The kitchen showed the marks of a man who fed his children adequately but without art, tins of beans and salted meat stacked with military precision, but no flour sack opened in what looked like weeks. The children's room upstairs was clean but bare of any softness, no quilt sewn with care, no small toys left where a child might reach for comfort in the night. Amelia, when Lucy finally coaxed her out from behind her father's legs, had her mother's chestnut hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and eyes that assessed Lucy with a wariness far too old for 7 years. Thomas would not come out at all, only watched from the stairs, thumb pressed hard against his lower lip, saying nothing. "You will want a schedule," Orville said, when Lucy had set down her trunk in the small room off the kitchen that would be hers. "Breakfast at 6:30. The children's lessons at 8, until the town has a proper schoolhouse built, which the county has promised for 2 years running and never delivered. Dinner at noon, supper at 6. I will not have chaos in this house, Miss Sutton. Chaos is how things get lost, people included." "I understand order, Mr. Hartwell," Lucy said, meeting his eyes steadily. "My father used to say a shop with no order in its ledgers was a shop already halfway to ruin. I will keep your hours." He nodded once, satisfied, and went back out to his splitting, and Lucy stood alone in the kitchen of a stranger's house, 600 miles from anywhere she had ever called home, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, something like the beginning of purpose. The first weeks passed in the particular rhythm of a household reorganizing itself around a new hand. Lucy rose before dawn to have the fire built and the coffee on, and she quickly learned that Orville Hartwell's exactness was not cruelty, but a kind of scaffolding he had built to hold himself upright since his wife's death, and that if she worked within it rather than against it, the two of them moved through the days with a surprising ease. Amelia thawed first, as children often do, drawn by small kindnesses that cost Lucy little but meant a great deal. A ribbon salvaged from Lucy's own trunk and tied into the girl's hair loose enough to be comfortable. A story told at bedtime about a girl in Ohio who had once fallen into a creek chasing a runaway hat, a patient hand teaching her stitches for a sampler. By the second week, Amelia had taken to following Lucy from room to room, chattering about her mother in fragments, the way she used to braid Amelia's hair, the songs she used to hum while she kneaded bread, and Lucy listened to every word as though it were precious, because she understood in her own bones what it was to carry a parent only in memory. Thomas took longer. He was a solemn child, watchful as a barn cat, and for the better part of a month he would do no more than accept a plate of food from Lucy's hands without meeting her eyes. It was Hank Dobbs, the ranch's one full-time hired man, an old cowhand with a face like sun-cracked leather, and a gentleness that surprised Lucy the first time she saw him coax a lame calf to its feet, who gave her the key to the boy. He was closest to his mother of the two. Hank told her one evening, as they sat shelling dried beans on the porch while the children played nearby. Amelia was already half a person of her own by the time Margaret passed, but Thomas was but 3, and he does not remember her the way Amelia does, not in whole pieces. He remembers her only in feelings, and I think the boy is afraid that if he lets himself feel warm toward you, he will lose the last bit of what he remembers feeling toward her. It is not you he is refusing, Miss Sutton. It is forgetting he is afraid of. Lucy turned that over for several days before she found her way toward it. She began, instead of trying to draw Thomas out with words, to simply exist alongside him without demand, humming while she worked the way Amelia said her mother used to hum, leaving him be when he wanted to be left, sitting near enough that he could reach for her if he chose without ever forcing the reaching. It was 3 weeks more before he first slipped his small hand into hers on the walk back from the creek and said, in a voice rusty from disuse, "Mama used to hum that same song." "Did she?" Lucy said, keeping her voice light though her throat had gone tight. "Then I am glad I know it so you can hear it still. Will you sing it sometimes? Any time you like, Thomas, any time at all." He did not let go of her hand the rest of the way to the house, and when she glanced up, she saw Orville standing on the porch, having watched the whole small exchange, his face unguarded for one unguarded moment before he composed it back into its usual careful lines and went inside without a word. But that night at supper, he served Thomas's plate first, a small thing, and caught Lucy's eye across the table with something that was almost, though not quite, a thank you. Order, Lucy came to understand, was the language Orville Hartwell used because he had lost the ability to speak any other. He did not say he was grateful for the mended shutter she had asked Hank to fix, or the curtain she had sewn from a bolt of blue calico bought in town with her own first wages, or the bread that now rose properly because she had found the yeast gone stale and replaced it without being asked. He said instead, "The house runs well," which she learned to hear as the compliment it was. He did not say he was pleased that Thomas had begun speaking again, but she saw him linger an extra moment at the boy's door each night, listening to him chatter to Lucy about the day, and she understood that the man's silence held more feeling in it than most men's speeches did. For her part, Lucy found herself watching for the rare moments his careful composure slipped. The way his jaw eased when Amelia laughed at something Hank said, the way his shoulders came down from around his ears when the day's chores were finished, and the children were fed and safe and asleep, the way he sometimes stood at the window in the evening looking out at land that had been his and Margaret's together, and she understood that beneath the exactness was a man still grieving, still holding himself together by strict hours and clean ledgers, because he did not trust himself to hold together any other way. She had not expected to like him. She had expected, from Pearl's warning, a hard and difficult employer to be endured for wages and nothing more. Instead, she found herself, by the time the first snow fell in earnest in late November, thinking of small things to tell him over supper because she liked the particular way his mouth almost curved when something amused him, liked the low, unhurried sound of his voice when he read aloud to the children from the one battered book of fairy tales that had survived from Margaret's girlhood, liked, more than she was willing to admit even to herself, the steadiness of him, the way a room felt different, felt anchored. When he was in it, the town of Willow Creek held its harvest dance the last Saturday before Thanksgiving, in the long room above the mercantile that served as church on Sundays and gathering hall the rest of the week. And Pearl Dutton would not hear of Lucy staying home to mind the children when Hank had already volunteered to sit with them. "You have been 6 weeks on that ranch working like a mule, and seeing no one but Hartwell and his children and old Hank," Pearl said, arriving at the ranch with a dress over her arm, a soft green wool that had belonged to her own daughter before she married and moved to Bozeman. "You will come to the dance, and you will wear this, and you will remember you are 24 years old and not 80. Orville, when Lucy came downstairs in the green dress with her hair pinned up the way Pearl had shown her, looked at her for a long moment before he seemed to remember himself and said only, gruffly, that the wagon was ready. But Lucy had caught the look, brief as it was, and she carried the warmth of it with her the whole ride into town. The dance hall was bright with lamplight and crowded with ranch families come in from every direction for 20 miles, fiddle music sawing away cheerfully in the corner, tables groaning with pies and cured hams brought by every woman in the county. Lucy had not danced since before her father's death, and she found herself swept immediately into a reel by a cheerful young man who introduced himself as Silas Reed, a cattle buyer up from Cheyenne who was, by his own admission, delighted to find a woman at a Montana dance who had clearly learned her steps from a proper Eastern dancing master. Silas Reed was handsome in an easy, well-fed way, quick with compliments and quicker with his opinions of the territory's cattle prices, and he made a point of claiming 2 more dances from Lucy before the evening was half done, and of bringing her punch, and of standing rather closer than strictly necessary, while he told her about his plans to expand his buying operation into Willow Creek permanently. Lucy found him pleasant enough company, nothing more, but she was aware, in the way a person is aware of weather changing, of Orville Hartwell standing near the wall with Hank, not dancing, watching. "Your employer does not care for dancing?" Silas asked, following her glance. "I could not say. I have not seen him dance at all since I came to Willow Creek." "A man who does not dance," Silas said, with the easy confidence of a man who has never doubted his own charm, "is a man who has given up trying to enjoy himself. A pity in one so young. He cannot be much past 30. Lucy did not answer that, because she found she did not much like hearing Orville spoken of that way, as though his grief were a failing rather than a wound still healing, and she excused herself not long after to fetch a plate of pie, and found, without entirely meaning to, that her path had carried her to where Orville stood. "You are not dancing," she said. "I have not danced since Margaret," he said, and then, as if surprised at his own honesty, looked away toward the fiddle player. "I am not opposed to the idea of it. I have simply not found the occasion since. Perhaps the occasion is only waiting on an invitation." He looked back at her then, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with schedules or ledgers or the exact hour dinner ought to be served, something that made the noise of the dance hall recede for a moment to a distant hum. "Are you inviting me, Miss Sutton?" "I believe I am, Mr. Hartwell." He held out his hand, and though his steps were rusty and he apologized twice for treading near her hem, Lucy thought she had never enjoyed a dance so much in her life. And when the fiddle slowed for the final turn she was keenly, uncomfortably aware of the warmth of his hand at her waist, of the way he was looking down at her, as though she were something he had not expected to find and did not quite know what to do with now that he had. Silas Reed asked her for one more dance before the evening ended, and Lucy, glancing toward Orville, saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, saw him look away and busy himself with his coat, and she understood, with a small thrill she was not proud of, that he had not liked watching another man's hands at her waist. She declined Silas's request, pleading tiredness, and rode home beside Orville in a silence that felt, for the first time, comfortable rather than strained, the children asleep against her shoulders in the back of the wagon, the cold, clear night full of more stars than she had ever seen in Ohio. "Mr. Reed seemed taken with you," Orville said finally, when they were perhaps a mile from the ranch, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "He was pleasant company for an evening, nothing more. He has money. A woman could do worse. A woman could also do better than a man who speaks of dancing as though it were a failing in another," Lucy said, more sharply than she intended, and then, softening, "I did not come west to marry the first man with a full purse who asked me to dance, Mr. Hartwell. I came west to make an honest life for myself, and I find I am making a good one at your ranch with your children, and I am content with it." He was quiet a long moment. "I am glad of that," he said at last, so low she almost missed it beneath the creak of the wagon wheels. "I had begun to fear you would find better prospects and leave us as the others did." "I am not the others," Lucy said, and meant it with her whole heart, and though neither of them said anything more the rest of the ride, she thought perhaps he had heard her, truly heard her, in a way that mattered. Thomas fell ill in the second week of December. A fever that came on suddenly after a day spent playing too long in wet snow despite Lucy's warnings, and by nightfall his small body was burning hot beneath the quilts, his breath coming in a rattling wheeze that frightened Lucy more than she let herself show. Orville rode the 6 miles to town and back in a driving sleet to fetch the doctor, and returned 2 hours later soaked through and half frozen himself, the doctor's diagnosis grim. A lung fever, not uncommon in children after a chill, dangerous but not, the doctor said, hopeless, if he was kept warm and fed broth and watched closely through the crisis. "Croup and lung fever together," the doctor said, packing his bag by lamplight. "I have seen children through worse. I have also lost children to less. Keep him upright when he coughs, keep the room warm but not stifling, and send for me again if his lips go blue." The word "send for me if his lips go blue" stayed with Lucy through the long night that followed, as she and Orville took turns sitting beside the boy's bed, sponging his forehead with cool water, coaxing spoonfuls of broth between fever-cracked lips, listening to every breath for the sound of trouble. Amelia hovered in the doorway until Lucy finally allowed her to curl up on a pallet in the corner of the room, rather than send her to bed alone and frightened. And so the 4 of them kept vigil together, the fire banked high, the wind screaming against the shutters outside. Near 3 in the morning, when Thomas's breathing turned suddenly ragged, and his small chest began to heave with the effort of it, Lucy felt real fear close its hand around her throat for the first time since her father's death, and she looked up to find Orville already moving, lifting the boy gently upright against his own chest, murmuring low words she could not make out, rocking him the way one might rock an infant though he was 5 years old and growing lanky. "Breathe, son," Orville said, his voice cracking on the second word. "Breathe for me, that is it, slow now." Lucy pressed a cool cloth to the boy's neck and throat, and between them, somehow, the crisis passed. The rattling breath eased. The color came back gradual and merciful to lips that had gone frighteningly pale, and by the time gray light began to show at the window's edge, Thomas was sleeping the deep, sweat-soaked sleep of a fever broken, his small hand curled around 2 of his father's fingers. Orville did not move for a long while after, simply sat with his son against his chest, and when Lucy finally reached to take the boy so that Orville might rest, he caught her hand instead, held it a moment in the gray dawn light, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted and entirely undone. "I could not have sat this night alone," he said quietly. "I have sat alone through worse nights than this and told myself I preferred it. I do not know that I do any more." "You are not alone, Orville," Lucy said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw it land on him like something physical, something he had not known he was waiting to hear. "You have not been alone since I came to this house, whatever you have told yourself." "No," he said slowly, as though testing the truth of the word. "I do not suppose I have." He did not let go of her hand right away, and when he finally did, it was with something like reluctance, and Lucy carried the warmth of his fingers against hers for the rest of that long, exhausted, grateful day, and understood that whatever careful order she had come to this ranch to keep, something else entirely had begun to take root in the keeping of it. But the closeness born of that long night did not settle easily into the days that followed. If anything, it seemed to unsettle Orville further, as though having reached for her once in his fear he now regretted the reaching. And he grew, through the middle weeks of December, more careful with her than before, more formal, retreating behind his schedules and his ledgers as though they were walls he could rebuild around a heart he had let show too plainly. It did not help that Pearl Dutton, meaning well but speaking too freely at the mercantile counter, had let slip to half the women of Willow Creek that Orville Hartwell's hired housekeeper had sat up with his sick boy all night at his side. And by the following Sunday, the church pews were humming with the particular kind of talk that small towns cannot resist. That a widower with a young, unmarried woman living under his roof, however respectably arranged, however chaperoned by children and hired hands, was a situation ripe for scandal, and that something ought to be done before tongues wagged the reputation of the whole Hartwell family into the ditch. Orville's mother-in-law, Margaret's mother, a formidable woman named Ida Bell who had moved to Willow Creek from Helena the year before to be near her grandchildren, arrived at the ranch the Tuesday following with her opinions fully formed and her patience for delicacy entirely absent. "It will not do, Orville," she said, seated stiff-backed at his kitchen table while Lucy, coloring furiously, pretended great absorption in the bread she was kneading. "A young, unmarried woman in your house, at your table, sitting up nights beside your son's bed. My Margaret has been gone but 2 years, and already the whole county is speaking of it." "Sutton is my housekeeper, Ida," Orville said, his voice gone tight. "She is here to mind my children, nothing more. I have eyes, Orville Hartwell, whatever else has failed me with age. I saw the way you looked at that dance in town, and half the ladies at church saw it besides. If you have feeling for her, then for heaven's sake do something honest about it. And if you have not, then find a married woman to keep this house before my grandchildren's name is dragged through talk that will follow them the rest of their lives." The words hung in the kitchen like smoke that would not clear, and Lucy, unable to bear the silence that followed, set down the bread and excused herself to check on the children, her face burning, her chest tight with an emotion she could not entirely name, equal parts humiliation and something rower, some fear that she had, without meaning to, brought trouble down on a family that had already borne enough of it. She did not hear what passed between Orville and Ida Bell after she left the room, only that the older woman departed within the half-hour, her sleigh bells jangling harsh against the cold, and that Orville did not come looking for Lucy for the rest of that afternoon, occupying himself instead with chores that did not strictly need doing, mending fence posts that had stood solid for years, as though physical labor might quiet whatever argument was working itself out inside him. That night at supper he was quieter than usual, and when the children had gone up to bed, he lingered at the table while Lucy cleared the dishes, until finally he spoke. "I owe you an apology for what my mother-in-law said today." "You owe me nothing, Mr. Hartwell." She had gone back to the formal address without quite meaning to and saw him flinch at it, small as the flinch was. "Orville," he corrected quietly. "I would have you call me Orville still if you are willing." Lucy set down the dish towel. "I do not wish to be the cause of talk that harms your children, Orville. If it would ease things, I could take a room in town with Pearl and come out only for the day's work." "No." The word came out fast, almost sharp, and he seemed startled by his own vehemence. He drew a breath, steadied himself. "No, I do not want that. I have spent 2 years telling myself that order was enough, that if I kept the hours right and the accounts balanced and the fences mended, I would not have to feel the size of what I lost. And then you came into this house, and within a month my son was speaking again, and my daughter was laughing again, and I found myself standing in my own kitchen wanting, for the first time since Margaret died, to talk to someone about my day rather than simply endure it. I do not know what to call that, Lucy. I have not let myself name it, but I know I do not want you gone from this house, and I will not pretend otherwise to satisfy Ida Bell or the church pews or anyone else." Lucy's heart was beating very fast. "Then what would you have us do, Orville? I cannot stay indefinitely as your housekeeper if the whole county believes there is more to it, and I cannot say honestly whether they are wrong." He looked at her a long moment, something working behind his careful composure, and then, as though the words cost him a great effort he was none the less willing to spend, he said, "I would not have you think I am asking this only to quiet gossip. I have known for some weeks now that what I feel watching you with my children, and watching you across this table each evening, is not the feeling a man has for hired help. I loved Margaret. I do not say that lightly or to diminish what I am trying to say now, but I find I have room in me still, room I thought the grief had used up entirely, and it is you who has shown me that. I am not skilled at courting, Lucy. I have not tried in a dozen years, and I was clumsy at it even then. But I would ask you if you are willing to let me try properly, as a man courting a woman he hopes to marry, rather than as an employer too afraid to say what he feels." Lucy stood very still, the dish towel forgotten in her hands, and felt something long held and carefully guarded in her own chest come loose at last. "I have been waiting," she admitted, "longer than I have been willing to say aloud, for you to ask me something like that. I did not come to Montana Territory looking for a husband, Orville. I came looking for work, and for a way to stand on my own feet after everything I had was taken from me. But I have found in this house something I was not looking for and did not know how badly I needed until I had it. I would be glad, very glad, to let you court me properly." He crossed the small kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands in his, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply stood there in the lamplight with the fire crackling low and the winter wind moving outside. Two people who had each come to this house needing something they had been too wounded or too proud to name, finding at last that the thing they needed was, unaccountably, each other. The courting that followed was, as Orville had warned, clumsy at times and all the sweeter for it. He brought her small things from town, a length of ribbon, a bag of peppermint candy for the children that he pretended was entirely for their benefit, though Lucy caught him slipping one into his own pocket. He took to reading aloud to all 3 of them in the evenings, rather than just the children, choosing longer chapters than strictly necessary, so that Lucy might sit near him a while longer after Amelia and Thomas had gone up to bed. He asked her opinion on ranch matters he would never have thought to consult a housekeeper on, and listened, genuinely listened, when she gave it. And when he kissed her for the first time, on a clear cold evening in the first week of January, with the whole sky blazing overhead with more stars than either of them could name, it was careful and searching and entirely without the guardedness that had marked every other part of him, and Lucy understood that whatever walls grief had built in him, she had found the door. But the winter of 1886 into 1887 would go down in the memory of every rancher in Montana Territory as one of the hardest any of them had known, and it was not finished testing the Hartwell family yet. The blizzard came without the mercy of much warning, the way the worst ones did, a bruise-colored line of cloud on the northern horizon in the early afternoon of a day that had begun clear and bitterly cold. And by the time Orville and Hank had gotten the last of the cattle pushed into the shelter of the lower pasture windbreak, the first hard gusts of snow were already stinging sideways with a violence that stole the breath from a person's lungs. Amelia and Thomas were safe in the house with Lucy, the fire built high, the shutters latched, when the trouble began. Thomas, restless with the peculiar excitement children feel at a storm's approach, had slipped out the kitchen door while Lucy's back was turned banking the fire, chasing after a barn cat that had bolted for the tool shed at the first crack of thunder-loud wind, and by the time Lucy realized he was gone the world outside had already gone white and roaring, the ranch house barely visible 30 feet from its own porch. "Thomas!" Her voice was torn away by the wind almost before it left her mouth. She grabbed her coat. shouted to Amelia to bar the door and not open it for anyone but her father or herself, and plunged out into a storm that had, within the space of 10 minutes, become something out of nightmare. Snow driving nearly horizontal, the cold clawing through wool and skin both, the ranch buildings reduced to vague gray shapes she navigated toward by memory more than sight. She found him, by grace or God's own mercy, huddled against the leeward side of the toolshed with the terrified cat clutched to his chest, too frightened and too cold to have gone any farther, and she wrapped her own coat around him on top of his and half-carried, half-dragged him back toward the house, only to find, with a horror that iced through her worse than the wind, that she had lost her bearings entirely in the whiteout, that the house that should have been 30 feet away was nowhere she could see, that the wind had scoured away every landmark and left her holding a freezing child in a world gone entirely white. She did what her father had once told her a person lost in bad weather ought to do, staying still rather than wandering farther astray, pulling Thomas into the lee of a fence post she had stumbled against, wrapping both coats around them both, shouting for help, though she knew the wind was tearing her voice to nothing before it traveled 10 feet. She thought of Orville, out with the cattle, not yet aware that his son was missing, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than the cold did, that she did not want to die out here without ever having told him plainly, in so many words, that she loved him. It was perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt like the whole of the night, before a shape loomed suddenly out of the white, a rope tied about its waist trailing back the way it had come, and Orville's voice, hoarse with shouting and raw with fear, calling their names. He had come back from the pasture to find Amelia alone and hysterical at the door, and had followed the only trail he could find, a length of rope run from the house to the barn for exactly such an emergency, extending it hand over hand into the storm on the chance, the desperate hope, that Lucy would have had the sense to stay near some fixed point rather than wander. "Here," Lucy screamed, and heard, impossibly, her own voice answered, and then Orville was there, gathering both of them against him, wrapping the rope twice about his own waist and Lucy's both, and half-carrying, half-dragging all three of them back along that thin lifeline of rope, until the black shape of the barn wall rose up out of the white and then, at last, the house itself, warm light spilling from a window where Amelia had kept the lamp burning and the door unbarred despite her own terror, watching for them. They fell together through the door into the warmth, and Orville did not let go of either of them for a long moment, his whole body shaking with cold and reaction both. And when Thomas had been stripped of his frozen clothes and wrapped in every quilt the house possessed, and settled by the fire with hot broth, shivering but whole and unharmed, Orville turned to Lucy and pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke every word he had not yet managed to say plainly. "I thought I had lost you both," he said into her hair, his voice breaking entirely on the words. "I have buried one person I love to this territory's cruelty already, Lucy. I do not think I could survive burying another." "You have not lost me," Lucy said, weeping now with the release of fear held too long. "I am here, Orville. We are both here. I would not leave you, not for any storm, not for anything at all." "Marry me," he said, so suddenly it seemed to surprise them both, the words coming out rough and urgent and entirely without the careful order he brought to every other part of his life. "Marry me, Lucy. I do not want to spend one more winter of my life wondering if I will get the chance to tell you I love you before the weather or fate or my own foolish pride takes that chance away. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the night Thomas's fever broke and you told me I was not alone, and I have been too careful, too frightened of losing another thing I loved, to say it plainly until this moment when I nearly lost you in truth. Marry me. Be my wife. Let my children call you mother if you are willing, and let me spend the rest of my life making certain you never doubt that you are wanted and needed and loved exactly as you are." Lucy laughed and wept together, an ordinary miracle of feeling, and framed his cold reddened face in her hands. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Orville Hartwell, I will marry you." I came to this territory needing work and expecting nothing more than wages and a roof, and I have found instead a family I love with my whole heart, and a man I love more than I have words to say plainly enough. Yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then in front of the fire, with Thomas watching wide-eyed from his nest of quilts and Amelia clapping her small hands with delighted, unrestrained joy, and outside the blizzard raged on unheeded, having done, in its violence, the one thing it could never have intended. It had burned away the last of the caution and grief and careful distance between two people who had needed, all along, only the courage to name what they already felt. The storm blew itself out by the following afternoon, leaving 3 feet of snow drifted against every fence line, and a stillness over the land that felt, to Lucy, like the world holding its breath in wonder at what had happened inside that small ranch house. Word traveled to town within the week, as word always did in a county where everyone's business was, sooner or later, everyone else's, and if Ida Bell had any lingering objections to the match, they dissolved entirely the day she arrived at the ranch to find Amelia and Thomas both wrapped around Lucy's skirts, glowing with a happiness she had not seen in either child since before her daughter's death, and she wept, this time from gladness rather than propriety, and pressed into Lucy's hands a small locket that had belonged to Margaret, saying only that her daughter would have wanted her children's new mother to have something of hers to remember her by. They were married in the last week of January, in the church above the Mercantile, with the whole town crowded in against the cold to witness it, Pearl Dutton weeping happily in the front pew, Hank Dobbs standing as best man in a coat brushed so clean it nearly shone, and Reverend Miles pronouncing them man and wife with a warmth that suggested he had been hoping to say those particular words over those particular two people for some weeks already. Amelia stood beside Lucy through the whole ceremony, holding a small bouquet of dried wildflowers Hank had helped her gather in the fall and pressed for exactly this occasion. And Thomas, solemn and proud in his best clothes, carried the ring on a small velvet cushion Lucy had sewn herself, and did not drop it once, though he confided to Lucy afterward, with the seriousness of a boy who had taken his responsibility gravely, that he had practiced walking with it, balance for 3 days beforehand to be certain. That evening, after the wedding supper at Pearl's boarding house had wound down, and the last of the well-wishers had driven home through the crusted snow, Orville carried Lucy over the threshold of the ranch house that was now truly hers as well as his, and set her down in the warm kitchen with its blue calico curtains and its bread rising properly on the sideboard and its whole atmosphere transformed, over the course of one autumn and one winter, from a house merely maintained into a home genuinely loved. "I have kept a ledger my whole life," Orville said, drawing her close in the lamplight, the children long since put to bed with excitement and sugar cake, "of every expense and every hour and every task that needed doing to keep this place from falling into ruin. I do not think I ever once wrote down, in all those years of careful accounting, what it was I actually needed. I do not think I let myself know." "And what did you need?" Lucy asked, though she thought she already knew the answer, wanted only to hear him say it. "You," he said simply. "Not order for its own sake, though I confess I will always want the fences mended and the accounts balanced. But you, Lucy. Someone to share the weight of it with. Someone whose voice I want to hear across the table every evening for the rest of my life. I did not know how to name that need until you came and filled it, and I do not intend to spend one more day of my life failing to tell you so." "I came here needing work," Lucy said, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, "and I told myself that was all I wanted, a wage and a roof and enough dignity to hold my head up after everything I had lost. I did not let myself name the rest of it either, the loneliness, the wanting of a family, the fear that I would spend my whole life keeping other people's houses in order and never have one that was truly mine. I have that now. I have you and Amelia and Thomas and this whole beautiful, difficult, wide-open country, and I would not trade it for anything in the world. Spring came late that year, as it often did in Montana Territory. But when it came in earnest, the creek running high with snowmelt, the cottonwoods budding out green along its banks, the whole ranch waking from winter into a season of new growth that mirrored, in its own quiet way, the new growth that had taken root in the Hartwell household. Lucy planted a garden that spring behind the house, the first the ranch had seen since Margaret's time, and Amelia helped her set the seeds in careful rows while Thomas, now chattering as freely as any 5-year-old ought to, ran back and forth fetching water and pronouncing his expert opinion on every seedling that pushed up through the dark soil. By the following winter, the winter of 1887, Lucy was carrying a child of her own, and Orville, who had once measured his days by the strict order of chores and ledgers, found himself instead measuring them by the small changes in his wife's condition, by the flutter of movement she described to him with wonder some evenings by the fire, by the growing softness of a household that had learned over the course of one hard year that love and order were not opposites after all, but partners, each making the other possible. The child, born in the first thaw of the following March, was a boy, and they named him Charles after Lucy's father, and Orville held his newborn son in the same rocking chair where he had once rocked a fevered Thomas through the worst night of that first winter, and wept, unashamed, tears of a joy so complete it seemed to reach backward and heal something in him that had been broken since Margaret's death, without ever asking him to forget the love that had come before, only to make room. As he had once told Lucy, he feared he could not for more. 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Margaret Pearl, for the two women, one lost and one found, who had each in her own way shaped the family Lucy and Orville had built together. And by the time Margaret Pearl was old enough to toddle after her older brothers and sister through the ranch yard, the Hartwell place had become known throughout the county not for the sorrow that had once hung over it, but for its warmth, for the wide table Lucy kept always ready for an extra guest, for the laughter that carried across the yard on summer evenings, for the particular happiness of a family that had been built, brick by careful brick, out of two people's willingness to name, at last, what they had needed all along. Amelia grew into a young woman as capable and warm-hearted as the mother she barely remembered, and the stepmother who had raised her through her most formative years. And when she married, some years later, a young rancher from the next valley over, it was Lucy who stood beside her fixing the last pins in her hair, both of them weeping happy tears, and it was Orville who walked her down the aisle of the same small church where he and Lucy had married, his throat too tight for speech, managing only to press a kiss to his daughter's forehead before giving her hand to the young man waiting. Thomas grew tall and steady, inheriting his father's careful hands with horses and cattle both, and though he remembered his own mother only in fragments and feelings, he never once doubted that he had two mothers who loved him, the one who had given him life and the one who had, on a night of fever and fear, taught him to breathe through his terror and come out the other side whole. Hank Dobbs stayed on at the ranch until he was far too old to work cattle any longer, content in his final years to sit on the porch teaching the younger Hartwell children to whittle and to shell beans and to tell stories about the early hard days of the ranch. And when he finally passed peacefully, in his sleep one warm summer night, the whole family grieved him as they would have grieved a beloved grandfather, because that, in every way that mattered, was exactly what he had become. Pearl Dutton lived long enough to dance at the weddings of all 4 Hartwell children, declaring at each one that she had known, from the very first moment she pressed a bowl of stew into Lucy Sutton's tired hands, that something good was going to come of a woman with that much backbone answering that particular advertisement. And Lucy and Orville, growing old together on the same land where they had first met as a desperate stranger, and a grieving widower each too proud to name what they needed, found that the years did not dull what had begun in that hard winter of 1886, but deepened it, the way good soil deepens with each season of careful tending, until what had started as a question of wages and order had become, quite simply and quite completely, a love neither of them had ever expected to find. And neither of them would, for all the rest of their days, ever again take for granted. On winter evenings, even decades later, when snow piled deep against the windows and the fire burned warm in the hearth, Orville would sometimes reach for Lucy's hand across whatever they were doing, ledgers or mending, or simply the quiet companionship of two people grown comfortably old together, and say, with the same wonder he had felt that first blizzard night so many years before, that he did not know what he had done in his life to deserve finding her, and Lucy would answer, every time, that she had not come to Montana territory looking to be found, only looking for work, and that the finding had been the best and least expected gift the wide, hard, beautiful country had ever given. Sorry. The ranch prospered in the years that followed, weathering droughts and hard winters and the ordinary trials of frontier life, but it never again knew the particular loneliness that had hung over it in the years after Margaret's death, because Lucy Sutton, who had arrived needing work, and Orville Hartwell, who had needed order, had found together, by the end of that first hard winter, the one thing neither of them had been able to name until it was standing plainly before them. A love steady enough to weather any storm, and warm enough to make a house, at long last truly a home.